All right, sweet. So Scott sent me a chat, and he was asking about where we typically enter a residence, through the front door or through a window, second story, stuff like that. And then there's a little bit more to it. But um, so this is a great question, and I think a lot is going to dictate why we kind of do what we do, especially for this stuff. A lot of that is going to be the stuff that I was talking about in our size up slide. So the reason why I put VES there was sort of to hit on this. VES is a targeted search, so basically we're going to go in, we're going to set up a ladder, we're going to go straight in through the second story window, break it out, go to the door, isolate the room, search it, bring someone out on the ladder, and that would take precedence over going in through the front door. What I will say is that on typical kind of residential structure fire, front door is going to be the way to go. But that can get congested, right? Because we also have the attack lines typically going through that door. The issues with breaking out a window, if we don't have to, we kind of talked about last week, which would be increasing fire dynamics, stuff like that, when we don't really need to. So going in through a window on the first floor, if we're not VESing something, is typically going to be ill-advised. The reason why we can break a window in VES is that we go to the other end of that room and we close the door. And so we isolate that kind of from the rest of the house in terms of fire flow. Um, how often are barred windows higher than the first floor? So there's stuff like, I forget what they're called right now, but essentially they're little bars on the windows of like apartment buildings to keep kids on the inside of them from falling out. So that's something to consider. Typical like barred windows, I don't see them super frequently. Feel free, Cap and Mark and Chris, to jump in if you guys have seen this, but typically we're just going to see that lower down on the house. Um, and if you see it higher up, right, this should probably kind of spike that situational awareness in terms of bars in general also, right? Like they're trying to prevent people from coming in, especially if they're on the second floor. That might be something to consider. What else we got? Okay, yeah, that was kind of just hitting on that. I don't know if anyone else here has seen bars on like second or third story windows just on a typical residential home. I know I haven't super frequently. That's not to say that they can't exist, but there are those things that I was talking about, like kid keepers or whatever they're called.
Yeah,
Cool.
I mean, if you ran across them, I think Tommy's right. You need to think in your mind, well, why are those there? What kind of value is in that second floor room that they would need to take those kind of precautions? And that may kind of keep you advised to what you're getting yourself into. But for the most part, unless it's like a split level and it's like a 1.5 floor, you're probably not going to see those on the second floor.
Cool. Yeah, feel free to send me more chats if you guys have questions and don't want to interrupt. All right. So again, kind of like the last slide, right? I I have to admit, I don't really like bring a whole lot of new stuff into the fire service, and to be honest, not a lot of people do. A lot of this is regurgitating and putting together concepts from other people. These are some of the people that I've learned a lot about, that have helped kind of shape my human performance stuff, my firefighter survival, RIT, Mayday, stuff like that. And it's something that I'm super passionate about. So some of my kind of mentors there, this guy on the left is Rick George. He was with Palm Beach County. He's an amazing dude. If you want to learn more about him, let me know. But he kind of spiked sort of this whole understanding of the human body for me and how we can kind of use that to our advantage and how it gets used to our disadvantage as well. The guys in the middle from Fit to Fight Fire, I'm sure you have heard of them before. John Sparrow, Tom Johnson, and Craig Stallway. They're with Aurora. Great guys. They've got a podcast. Listen to it if you've got time. They also are really big on kind of the fitness side of stuff and putting that together with human dynamics. Top right is Cap Williams, who kind of like started off this whole kind of trend for me. He's got great stuff on mental resiliency. So feel free to jump in, Mark, if you got stuff to add. And then bottom right is Polly Capo with When Things Go Bad. He's up in Estes Park. He's the training captain there. But all of the people on this slide have really kind of helped me push this forward. So if you need more information on them, let me know. This quote typically applies to when I teach this class with the hands-on portion, but it really kind of starts getting into the mindset of what we're going to talk about tonight with survival. If we start getting comfortable with where we're at, it really impedes our ability to grow. So we need to be comfortable with getting uncomfortable, right? If you talk to anyone in the fire service who says they love being blacked out and in confined space, they're straight up lying because nobody likes that, right? Being in confined space sucks. Being blacked out sucks. But training and drilling in those environments is really what's going to allow us to grow and kind of avoid being in that comfort zone so that stuff doesn't come crashing down on us. So keep that in mind when you're training, and eventually once we start to do some of the human performance side of stuff on survival, because I'll push your limits if you let me, and it'll make you a better person for it. So let's get into it. So some of the stats again to kind of start off and kind of give us a picture of what we're dealing with here. These are from Project Mayday. So the same basic idea that we talked about with the firefighter rescue survey in earlier slides, but this is kind of bringing together all of the data surrounding Maydays, when they happened, why they happened, what happened after people called them, stuff like that. So take a look at some of these stats. Again, this is probably going to start influencing how we start training, and it should influence kind of how you train yourself. So those last couple slides on air usage, or the last couple bullets on air usage, are super important. So once you guys start coming online, we really need to start practicing in our gear, getting an idea of kind of what that heat does to our body when we're moving around, and then what that does to our air usage, right? So average air usage according to this is usually 80 to 100 liters per minute. It usually gets bumped up to almost double that when we get into a Mayday, but you should really figure that out for yourself. So once you start coming online, if you're on shift and we've got the ability to train on air, do it. Start to get an idea of what it feels like to breathe down a bottle, and we'll start doing drills with that so that you're not kind of diving straight into it on your own, because it can be kind of traumatic at first. But once we start getting comfortable, right, we should start to get a typical idea of what it's like to move around wearing our SCBA in gear, how much air we use, how long that bottle actually lasts, right? On the side of our bottles, it says 45 minutes. It's really, really difficult to work inside of a structure fire for 45 minutes on that bottle, especially if you're not super trained on it. So we're going to talk about SCBAs here on the next slide. But any questions on any of this data or Project Mayday in general? Cool. So that last slide, just the bullet there, we kind of have to start thinking about our crew integrity here, in the sense of if you get into a bad spot, the person next to you could be the person who's trying to save your life. So we kind of need to push each other forward. We need to push ourselves forward, because at the end of the day, stuff could be up to them. So let's get into it. I know someone was talking about MSA bottles. I'm not as well versed on those as I am with Scott's, um, but I'll try to talk about them a little bit. Um, so this picture on the right is our heads-up display. So when you put your regulators on, I don't think you guys have ever had your regulators on, um, but if you have, this is what you'll see. So you basically clip this thing into your face, and it lets us breathe, and it's got these lights on it. So 4 green lights means we're good. We've got like a full tank, basically, you can think about it. Once we drop a light off, we're going to have, or sorry, that would be 2 green lights if we're on a full tank. Once we drop a light off, we'll have 1 green. That's going to tell us we've got 3/4 of a tank left. 1 amber or yellow is going to typically be center. I think that that is 2 yellow lights on an MSA, but I'm not super sure. If anyone knows, feel free to correct me. But yellow or amber is typically going to be half on your heads up display, and then 1 red is going to be your vibra alert. So on Scott's, we've got this thing called a vibra alert. And basically what will happen is once you breathe down um, to that point, it will start vibrating your whole face, so that you kind of know like, hey, I have a third left, or hey, I have a quarter left. And the difference there is generations of Scott breathing systems. So when you look at your tank, when you come on shift, you're either going to see a 5.5 or a 4.5 Scott. There's ways to know that. I'll show you once we're in person, because again, it's kind of clunky to try to describe it over the computer. But 5.5, which is the newer generation, is going to set off your vibra alert at a third. A Scott 4.5 is going to set it off at a quarter. And that's the older generation. So what started happening was firefighters were going into buildings and they were working until their vibra alerts went off, and then they were running out of air when they were trying to get out of the building. So Scott came up with the idea of bumping that time up. So they now set this off at a third, in theory, giving more people time to get out of a building. Uh, Cap, I don't know if you guys have talked about air usage yet, but um, I would say if your vibra alert goes off inside of a building, you probably did something wrong. So we really need to not rely on that vibra alert to tell us it's time to go. That's kind of just like a fail safe in case we get to that point. MSAs are going to have like a bell that goes off, and your face won't vibrate. So just know that kind of difference there. If you start hearing bells, that's from MSA, or yeah, MSA tanks. And I think that those also go off at 33%. Um, so a third there. Again, feel free to correct me if someone knows more about MSAs. Um, so high versus low pressure. When you clip your tank into your pack, it's going to be in high pressure. This thing that you clip onto your face is called a regulator, and that's going to take that high pressure and it's going to bring it down into low pressure. So we can't really breathe in high pressure air, and we need to convert that into something that we can breathe, and we do that through the regulator. The reason why that becomes important is once we start talking about RIT stuff, there's 2 ways that we can help out a firefighter who doesn't have enough air. One is from the high pressure side, one is from the low pressure side. We'll get into that in a second. Actually, we'll get into that towards the end, but we'll get into it. The 2 alarms that we have on our packs, we already kind of talked about the first one, which was our vibra alert, or for your MSAs, that the bells, I don't know what they call them, but the other one is a pass. So on our packs, we basically have a little sensor on the back that feels movement. So if you've been still for a while, it will start going through these kind of levels of alarms. You guys will definitely start hearing what they sound like once we start playing around with packs. And if you watch like any video from a structure fire, you'll hear them start going off. But basically, pass alarms will tell us when there's a lack of movement. Low air alarms, which would be your vibra alert or the bells, will tell us we're running out of air. We hit on that difference between the 5.5s and the 4.5s. which was the increase in time that you have with the vibra alert going. So a third for 5/5s, a quarter for 4/5s. This is super important. Study this slide if you can. Air is your life, right? So if you know how to use the clock that we give you, it'll make your life a lot easier when you're inside of a building. So we're going to go through the emergency procedure really quick. Again, this is really hard to kind of just like talk about without trying it out, but we'll talk about it. If you guys have questions, stop me. If anyone wants to add anything, feel free. So the first thing that's going to happen, right, is we're going to realize that we're having an air crisis. So let's just go through this as if we're going through an air crisis. So that might be an unexpected vibra alert, restricted breathing, something like that. We're going to then move into a rescue position. I'm not going to go through what that looks like, but know that that's the next step. We'll hit on it once we start doing hands-on stuff. We'll start doing rescue breathing, and then we're going to kind of go through our tank and try to feel what's going on here. Again, this is a little bit higher level than where we're at right now, but just know we've got kind of a big procedure that will play out once we start kind of realizing that we've gotten into a bad spot. This will eventually end with a mayday, and we'll talk about what that actually is in a few slides here. As I said, the emergency procedure is just kind of hard to go over through the computer, so we'll do that once we get into the class. But we're essentially just going through and inventorying everything on our pack, making sure our system is working like it should and that we don't have any hoses clamped, anything like that. So questions on just how the SCBA functions on these LEDs or these heads-up displays, differences between 4/5, 5/5, MSAs, anything like that. Cool. So I want to talk a little bit about biology before we start getting into how we actually survive, because it's really important to understand how your body works so that we can kind of use it to our advantage, right? So we've got these two basic systems in our body. We've got sympathetic and parasympathetic. So parasympathetic is probably where you're at right now, right? We're kind of hanging out. Our body is sort of just doing its thing, right? Like we're breathing, we're digesting, we're kind of just sitting here resting and digesting, right? We don't have to think about it too much. Sympathetic is typically when a threat is introduced to us. We're going to do this fight, flight, freeze response. This is really interesting to learn about because it can save your life, but it can also be a huge detriment to you. So once we get into the SNS kind of system of our body, it starts releasing hormones like epi and norepinephrine, basically increasing our heart rate. I don't know if any of you guys are medics or needle fairies, as we call you sometimes, but those drugs should kind of make sense, right? That's what we would give to people who are not doing super well to get their heart started again. The parasympathetic, on the other hand, releases hormones to kind of decrease your heart rate. So figuring out what our signs are that we're in the sympathetic nervous system and how to get back out of that into the parasympathetic can be super important for us. It'll slow down our breathing, it'll slow down our heart rate, and it'll actually allow us to think more clearly. Once our heart rate starts getting up super high, some of our brain functions start to kind of shut off, and some of our motor skills start to sort of drop out. So fine motor skills, critical thinking, stuff like that starts to sort of slow when our heart rate gets up super high. I'll hopefully be able to show you what that looks like for yourself at some point. But you can kind of look at some of those heart rate points down below in terms of what it would actually do to your body. I know it sounds kind of far-fetched, but these are pretty legit. I've experienced a lot of these, and it's not only scary, but you feel like you don't have control, and being able to kind of center yourself and regain balance in terms of parasympathetic and sympathetic can make the difference between life and death, literally, for you. So we'll talk about what that might present as in this next slide on an LODD, and then go through some of the ways that we can figure out what this looks like for us and how to come out of it. So anybody have questions on biology stuff? I know it's kind of skimming the surface, or maybe you're just super bored by it, but if anyone has questions so far, let me know. All right, this is Brett Traver. He died on March 14th, 2001. He was a firefighter in Arizona. He was on the job 4 years. They went into a pretty big supermarket fire. I guess just a side note on larger fires, right? If you're going into a big building that's blacked out and hard to move around, it's probably like a pretty not great situation that you're getting yourself into. So just to kind of set the stage there, literally imagine being in the supermarket, not being able to see anything with tons of smoke. It's not really a great place to be at. He began to run out of air. He told command ordered an evacuation of the building of everyone inside. Most people made it out. He did not. There were a couple of people with him, tried to figure out how to get out of this building. There's a lot of debris that was all over the place, as you can imagine in a supermarket, and they were kind of getting tossed around. So they eventually sent in a RIT crew to try to get them. And several teams attempted to pull him out of the building. Everyone else that he was with eventually was taken out of the building or found their way out. He did not. And several people actually made contact with him. They reported physically grabbing him and putting him on the search or the attack line, telling him how to get out of the building. And he literally stood up, turned around, and sprinted away from them. So this is some of the stuff that can start to happen when we start falling into the sympathetic nervous system. Your brain really just stops working. Fear can have these crazy effects on people. And that's not to say that he was a coward or that anything was wrong with him. It happens to everybody. And if we don't train on it, it can happen to you too. So that's kind of the premise of why we're talking about this chapter and why I love teaching it, why I love training on it. But again, when we think about these LODDs, it's not to point fingers at departments or people, it's to learn about how actions caused something to happen. So this is kind of a good example of how fear can start to sort of overrun your body if you don't take care of it. Questions on anything about Brett or anything biology so far? All right. Breathing is probably the best way to actually pull yourself back into the parasympathetic nervous system. I don't know if anyone plays around with breathing techniques already, but they're super powerful for pretty much every kind of facet of your life. So we're going to talk about 3 as they pertain to firefighting. So the first one is box breathing. This was used in BUDS. It's a really good technique for kind of bringing yourself back, centering, being able to think clearly again. So if you think about drawing out a physical box and you put arrows going around in a clockwise motion, you've got 4 segments to breathing, right? The first one would be at the top of the box, and that would be to inhale. The side, the right corner or wall, whatever of the box is to hold. The bottom is to exhale, and then the left wall is to hold again before that inhale. So we want to assign some sort of time to each of these. For me, 4 seconds works. For you, it might be 10 seconds, it might be 2 seconds. Whatever it is, start playing around with it and figure out what's right for you. The benefit of box breathing is that it kind of forces us to fall into a pattern, right? When we start getting into weird situations, we start to hyperventilate. We're just sucking down our bottles as quickly as we can. box breathing forces a pattern on you and it forces your brain to actually start thinking. It'll decrease your blood pressure, it'll decrease your respiratory rate, your heart rate, and it'll bring you back into that parasympathetic nervous system. Um, Train on this when you're sitting in your chair. Um, See the effects that it actually has on your body, because I'm sure you will. And once you're comfortable with that, start putting it into your workouts, right? When you're in a run, start trying to see if you can actually do this box breathing. Whatever, exert yourself, work it into that when you have a higher heart rate so that it's not hitting you like you've never seen it before when you get into a bad situation and you need to use it. Hum breathing is the next one. This is a super good technique. That's what I'm using in this picture here. We'll talk about it in a second. This is also called the Riley rescue breathing technique, but it's the same basic concept as box breathing, right? So it's going to force us to fall into a cycle. The cycle here is to inhale for 4 seconds, hold for 8 seconds, exhale for 10 seconds. On your exhale, you want to hum. So this gives us a couple of things. First, it forces us to slow down our exhalation, and it also has psychological effects. So it will actually calm you down to hum than if you were just straight up exhaling. Again, those numbers for inhale, hold, exhale are guidelines, right? That's not like if you do them at 2 seconds, 4 seconds, and 12 seconds, you're doing it wrong. We just need to force ourselves to fall into a pattern. So again, figure out what that actually means for you. A good way to practice something like this would be walking with a breath. So if you think about taking a breath in for 2 steps, hold it for 4 steps, try to exhale for 5 steps or whatever it might look like for you. You can practice that literally just walking around your house. Super good technique for, again, decreasing all of your systems in your body and bringing you back into that parasympathetic world. Belly breathing is how we really should be breathing all of the time. And basically what it does is expand our diaphragm, which allows our lungs to more efficiently take in air. So if you were to lay down on your back and put your phone or a marker or something on your belly, when you take a breath in, if you think about breathing through your belly button, you should see that object rise on your stomach. We want to avoid breathing with our chest or breathing with our shoulders because it's not a super efficient way to breathe, right? When we're actually using our diaphragm, we're forcing our lungs to come down and take in as much breath as possible. This is super good for um, bringing yourself out of an anxious state, out of a panic state, and it can be combined with both of these techniques above it. It has the same kind of homeostatic effects as the box breathing does above, which would be a decreased blood pressure, respiratory rate, and heart rate. This is usually used by snipers as a tactic to kind of center themselves and calm their body before they have to take a shot. Again, all of these techniques are whatever works for you. So if you hate hum breathing, cool. If you hate box breathing, whatever, figure out which one works for you, because if you're not comfortable with it, it's going to actually have a negative impact on you. So if you're forcing yourself into this cycle and it's not comfortable, your body is going to want to react differently than if it was comfortable with it. So really play around with this, figure out kind of what works for you, what doesn't work for you, and you'll eventually fall into a good pattern that you have. So just a view of what this could look like for you. In this picture, this was where I first really learned breathing techniques. I'm using a combination of wheel breathing and hum breathing. We're not going to talk about wheel breathing because it's higher level, but we'll get into it once you guys are crushing it on the line for a little bit. In this picture, I was coming off of a burn building. I was wearing a heart rate monitor. My heart rate was at 170. If you remember that slide before on biology, that's pretty high up there. And as you can imagine, I was sucking down air pretty good. I hit Vibra Alert on a 4.5 Scott, so 45-minute bottle. My Vibra Alert went off saying I've got a quarter of my air left. I have 170 heart rate. And through practicing, I was able to make that last an hour and 6 minutes. So that's kind of the impact that these breathing techniques can have for you. Practice them, make sure you get super comfortable with them. If you got questions, let me know. It's not going to be easy at first, right? It's just like anything, you really need to practice and train on it until you get comfortable. Questions on breathing? Anything that
Tommy,
anyone wants to add?
what's your normal work time on that 25% of a bottle? Just to
A
give them
lot
a range.
less, a lot less than that. So yeah, to give you guys like a baseline, I guess, I usually last like 7 minutes on that. And that's based off of what I'm doing. So if I was actually in a Mayday situation trying to get out of a building, it's probably going to be less than that, honestly. So a quarter of a bottle is not a hell of a lot of time.
But on the flip side, the fact that he has thought about it and practiced it, let's just say part of a wall fell on him and he was trapped, and we were coming to help him and get him out. He can feel comfortable knowing that, you know what, even though my Viber alert is going off, I've made this bottle last over an hour. I'm okay. I can stay calm. I can wait for them to get to me, and I'll be okay, and that. So there's lots of different aspects, not only practicing the breathing, but putting yourself in that situation. You can run on a treadmill until you get to Viber alert, and then just hunker down somewhere in the workout room and see how long you can last that bottle, just to give yourself some experience and some peace of mind, knowing that you have put yourself in that situation and you can survive.
Yeah, and that's an awesome point. The mental benefit that you get out of this is huge. So what Kat was saying, definitely take that to heart. Practice this, get comfortable, because this is a super powerful tool. And honestly, it can be used outside of the fire service too. So thanks for that, Kat. Any other questions on breathing? Anything anyone else wants to throw in here? All right, let's talk about Maydays. So Mayday, Mayday, Mayday is going to be what we say when we get into trouble and we need help, right? It's kind of self-explanatory why we would say that, but it's going to be 3 times of saying Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. It's not once, not twice. Say it 3 times. Now, the caveat to saying this Mayday stuff, again, all of this is going to go out the window if you haven't trained on it. If you don't know what your body feels like when you get into a bad situation, but start practicing this stuff now. You don't have to be in a fire building. You don't have to be really anywhere. Just think about this in your mind of, hey, right now, if I were to call a Mayday, what would I say? So what that would look like, right, is first we're going to call Mayday, 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 and we're going to pause. We're going to let go of the cue on our mic, and we're going to wait for someone to acknowledge that. Typically, it's going to be your IC. It could be dispatch, but wait for someone to say, I heard a Mayday, Mayday, Mayday on fire. Go ahead, calling unit with your Mayday. Once you get that, you know that someone's listening to you, right? If you're just calling out Mayday, you could be on the wrong channel. You never know what might happen. Maybe your radio got turned off. So Mayday, 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 pause, wait for someone to get back to you. The next thing we're going to talk about is Lunar. There's a couple of different versions for talking about kind of giving your report over the radio for what you need. Lunar is my favorite. We can talk about some stuff later on for differences between different ways to do this, but for tonight, let's just focus on Lunar. So what that stands for is location, unit, name, air, resources. So when we give our Mayday, 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 command's going to come back. It's going to say, go ahead with your Mayday, and you're going to say location. So I'm at the Alpha Bravo corner of the building. This is engine 55, firefighter Vesely. And then in terms of air, let's talk about our LEDs. So I've got one yellow, I've got two green, I've got a flashing red, whatever it is. And then you need to tell them what you need. So if a wall fell down on you, like Cap was talking about in the last example, say, like, I need rescue, wall fell on me. I need someone to come get me out. If you need air, talk about that. If it's hot, talk about heat. Um, so the flow of this would be Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. Wait, the captain's gonna acknowledge that. And then I'm gonna go ahead and give my lunar. So Alpha Bravo corner, engine 55, firefighter vessel. I've got one yellow and I need air. Um, really straightforward. But again, if you start getting into a bad situation and you haven't practiced this, it's all going to go out the window. So really start drilling in that lunar into your mind when you read about it in your chapter, and then just start going through it in your house, right? If you're sitting there and you think about it and you think like, hey, if I had to call a mayday right now, what would I do? How would I talk about my lunar? Um, Stuff like that. So we need to start kind of getting comfortable with what lunar stands for and how to give it quickly without kind of thinking about it too much. That last bullet there sort of pertains to this picture here. Don't wait, right? This is kind of like a common theme in the fire service. Sometimes we like to think that we're more capable of stuff than we might be. If you think a situation is going bad, call it out early. It's always a lot better to say, hey, never mind, I figured it out, I'm good, than to call a mayday after it's really too late. We do have a restricted amount of time in a building, right? We can't just sit there forever and figure it out. Our air is going to dictate how much time we have in our building, and you're going to be kind of the best judge of that. So if things seem like they're starting to go bad, you need to call a mayday sooner rather than later. And we have to kind of think about this as a probability on any structure fire that we go to. Does mayday stuff, lunar stuff make sense to people? Do we have questions here? If you have any questions at all, ask them, because this is super important. This is kind of the base of everything that we would do once we get into trouble. All right. Um, this is kind of my survival sequence. Again, it's this sort of similar to when we were talking about the emergency procedure for SCBA. It might be getting into a little bit much right now, but it's good to start kind of thinking through these steps. So um, once we start to get into that bad situation, the first thing that I want to do is an inventory of myself, right? What is my kind of like status? Where's my air at? Is my body okay? Did a wall just fall on me? Do I have a broken leg now? Am I able to walk? Whatever. And then do people know where I am? Am I by myself? Am I with my partner? Kind of what is going on around me? Take a little inventory of yourself before you do anything, right? Um, Look is about orienting yourself. So where are the exits around me? Can I see them? Can I get to a stairwell, a window, a bulkhead, a walkout basement, something like that? Is there something around me that I can see that's in my direct vicinity that I can kind of take advantage of to get out of here? If not, we need to go ahead and call that mayday, mayday, mayday if we're in a bad situation. Sit or sprint sort of falls into what we were talking about in terms of shelter in place, right? Should I make an effort to get out of here? That would be a sprint. Or should I settle in and wait? That would be a sit. So, a couple of things to think about when you're making this decision, right? If I'm sprinting, if I'm trying to get out of here quickly, do I have enough air to do that? We have to kind of assume that this is going to take a massive amount of air and energy to get out of a building if we make this decision to get out. Do I actually have enough to get me out of there, and is my body physically capable of it? If not, and I'm sitting, are people going to come for me? Do they know where I'm at? I just called my mayday, so I should have given my location to where people are, right? But think about that. Was it actually a good location? Are people going to be able to get to me easier? And then on top of that, if I actually stay here, can I survive in this environment? What are the fire conditions like? Stuff like that. Am I hurt? Am I stuck? What's kind of going on? right now if I'm sitting? How can I make this better for myself? Once you make that decision, we need to set up, right? If you're sprinting, let's establish a plan or an end goal. So that might look like bail out a window, get to the stairs. We need to focus on small stuff here, and we're going to talk about that in the next slide. If you're sitting, let's get to the best location that we can and settle it, right? Am I protected from heat where I'm at? Am I in a good, obvious spot? Like, I obviously don't want to climb underneath anything where someone might not find me in case I go unconscious. Put yourself in a good position. And then once we kind of have that plan set up, action, right? Move and execute your plan. Um, and let someone know what you're doing. So if you're sprinting and suddenly you see a window that you can get out of after you call the Mayday, get back on the radio and say, hey, I'm coming out this window on the Alpha Bravo corner, whatever, so that the search team knows and they don't have to come in looking for you, and so that we can get resources to that window that you're coming out to actually get you out of there. Um, Reevaluation after your action, after you're executing your plan, how did it go? If you're sprinting and something isn't working out, should I keep trying harder or should I maybe transition to a sit? If I'm in a sit, are my conditions getting better or worse? If they're getting worse, I may not have the option to sit here anymore, right? Look around, and if opportunities present themselves, take them. Um, Again, if you're changing your plan, you got to get on the radio and let people know what you're doing. Um, these are some of my steps. Again, I don't want to make like a good acronym for it or anything like that. This sequence is something you're going to have to figure out how it looks for yourself, and you're going to have to get really comfortable with it. And the only way to do that is to put yourself into these situations. Questions on anything that we just hit in terms of sequencing? All right, let's talk about how to get through. Um, that picture on the right is of the bell at Buds. That's what you'd ring if you decide to quit. Um, a lot of people don't. The great ones don't, but a lot of people do. So a lot of these tips come from them, super inspired by the SEALs, and their tactics work in terms of getting through bad situations, right? So the first one is segmentation. We kind of talked about that a little bit in the last slide. Segmentation is making small kind of goals, or small kind of points that you need to get to. So I don't know if anyone here is a runner, but once you start getting into a bad spot in your running, which happens to me after about 20 feet, you can start setting goals for yourself, right? Like, I'm going to run to that next telephone pole, I'm going to run to that next driveway, to the mailbox, whatever it is. That can kind of get you through in the short term, and it is a better way for your brain to focus on what you need to do immediately next. Goal setting, sort of similar to that, right? This would say, like, I'm going to get to 3 telephone poles down and then I'm going to take a break, or I'm going to try to get up these stairs. I'm going to go 2 steps and then I'm going to take a break and I'm going to reevaluate. Um, Anchor phrasing, also super powerful. And this needs to be built into your training in order for it to work. So the SEALs use the phrase only easy day was yesterday, but stuff could flow in like, let's do it, you've trained for this, you got this, stuff like that. Some positive kind of phrase that has been conditioned to teach your brain and your body that I know what I'm doing here, I can get through this, right? This anchor phrase is a lot more powerful than you think it is, if you start training with it and using it. And that kind of flows into positive self-talk, right? We need to be positive if we're going through kind of a bad situation like that. Because if we're negative and we keep talking to ourselves in a negative manner, it's only going to make stuff worse. Um, Visualization, again, one of my favorites here. And there's a couple of ways to do this, right? There's 3 main ways of visualizing. The first would be looking out of your eyes. The second would be looking at you as like another person. The third would be kind of taking a bird's eye view of a situation. So um, this is super helpful in terms of kind of forgetting about physical exertion, if that sort of makes sense. If you can try to visualize yourself from a bird's eye view doing what you're doing, somehow it moves your brain away from the immediate pain or situation that you're going through. Um, the other super awesome thing about visualization, which I've already talked about already, is it's a really important training tool that we have. Um, this was a huge benefit for Michael Phelps, winning all of his golds, and he's said that several times. The Blue Angels literally sit in a room before all of their shows in the positions that they would be in their planes, and they will literally move their hands along with how they would move their controls, stuff like that. Um, Visualization straight up works, and it's something that we can train on sitting in our house. Um, Once we start getting comfortable with stuff like putting on our bunker gear, doing bunker drills in your head can actually make you better at doing bunker drills in person. And sometimes it can even make it better than actually training in person. Visualization is incredibly powerful. So use it, start to get comfortable with it, and start training on some of these kind of techniques to get through bad situations. Questions on any of this stuff? All right, let's talk about getting firefighters out of bad places. So we've got a couple of different ways that we need to think about moving firefighters, right? Doors, stairs, windows. We need to talk about packaging, dragging, and sheltering. So doors are relatively straightforward, right? This kind of flows back in through all the stuff we've been talking about in terms of search and stuff like that. If we have a door that's close, we need to think about bringing them back out that door if it's not putting them in a worse situation and we don't have a better option, right? If we need to make a door, that's something we can do. I'm not going to get super into that, but we can train on it at some point. We've got the tools to do that. Stairs, we need to consider going up or down, right? It's really hard to bring anybody up or down stairs, especially firefighters who have 150 pounds potentially of extra gear on them. Um, we're going to play around with a couple of different ways to move firefighters up and down stairs once we get into the hands-on stuff. Um, and I know, I'm sorry, this is kind of like such a tease of stuff that we can do, but it'll make a lot more sense once we start getting hands-on, and it might just wash over if we do it here. So just know that we've got different tactics for moving up and down stairs, and we'll show you what that looks like on one of these Saturdays. Windows, we need to consider where we're going to bring someone out if we go to a window, right? Do we have a ladder to take them out? Do we not have a ladder to take them out? Can we get a ladder there quickly? And actually getting a firefighter onto a ladder is, again, challenging, something that we'll talk about in person again. I know, I'm sorry. Packaging, I've got a few videos that we're going to go through a little bit later. But we're going to mainly hit on SCBA conversions. So again, this probably won't make a ton of sense since you haven't been in SCBA, but if you think about the pack, it's sort of like a backpack, and we've got kind of like a waist belt. So when we get to a firefighter, we can pull one of their legs up, they can clip that underneath their leg, and then we can move them. I think I've got a video on that a little bit later on here so you guys can see what that looks like. But essentially what that does is it secures everything down so we can actually use those straps to pull a firefighter if we need to, just like you see in that picture there. Dragging, this is when our webbing can come into place, when some of our tools can come into place. We can kind of get leverage on a firefighter if we need to with webbing, but dragging is going to be our kind of basic method for getting a firefighter out of a building, right? So we need to start practicing it. We need to get really good at it. And then finally, shelter. We've talked about this a few times, but shut the door, hang out, ask for resources. The caveat to this being, let's make sure that this is actually a good tenable space before we actually set up camp in a room. Questions on that before we move into some specific kind of scenarios? All right, let's talk about basements again. Some considerations for the basement, and the basement, according to Project Mayday, is one of the most popular places for people to call a Mayday. And the reason for that is people fall through the floors, right? So there's a couple of reasons that, or a couple of things we should be considering here when we're going to get someone in a basement. The first one would be trauma, right? So if someone's in a basement and they call the Mayday, they probably fell into the basement. They could be hurt. We don't really know what's going on with them, but just keep that in mind that they probably fell down into that basement. So we might consider bringing in some sort of tool or something that would help us actually drag that victim out, and just assume that they're not going to be able to walk out on their own. Um, Heat is another big consideration here. If we've got a fire in the basement, or if we've got someone who fell into the basement, um, that just created a huge hole in the floor. And someone fell into the basement because there was a fire underneath them and it weakened the floor joists and they fell through, right? So once we fell through, we've got this huge hole to feed that fire. It's going to make it hotter. It's probably going to make it not a super good situation down there. And on top of that, we're probably going to have a ton of objects that just fell down on top of that firefighter in the basement. Um, so before we kind of run into this basement scenario, right, a couple of things that we need to keep in mind for how we're actually going to find this victim when we find them. There's a few methods here that we can talk about. The first one is a harness pull. We're going to watch a video of that on the next slide. But this is basically pulling someone up and out from their harness. We can try to throw a ladder down there so that they can walk out. This assumes that they can walk. And then hose lift would be lowering a hose through there. We'll pull them up and out through the hose. Again, we can show you what that looks like hands-on. And then up the stairs if we can, right? The caveat to this is, again, it's really hard to move people upstairs, and assume that if they fell into the basement, there's trauma and they probably can't walk up the stairs. Otherwise, they probably would have already, right? So before we get into this next video, Cap, I don't know if you sent out that video, or if you guys watched that I had on the Mayday in California. Have you guys seen that?
I think I sent that out in the group that you sent me. It was all, they were all in one batch, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Yep, I sent it out.
Okay, did you guys have a chance to watch that video?
Was that the apartment building with the six like units and the firefighter called a mayday in the upstairs?
No, so that was the ATF reconstruction. That was for the vertical vent class, or the vent class.
Right, okay.
This one, yeah, this one was like a reconstruction of a Mayday in California. It was pretty well done. You probably would have remembered it if you watched it. Maybe I forgot to attach this link. I'll send it out. We're not going to watch this next video then because you kind of need that first one for this one, but I will send that video out in an email after that, or after tonight rather. So we'll skip that for now and we'll just go on to some of the other basic drag techniques, packaging, stuff like that. When we talk about ground floors, right, this is kind of our best case scenario. So we do have to kind of consider why someone called a mayday on the first floor, right? They probably would have walked out of the front door if they could have. So think about why they called a mayday, right? We're thinking probably there's heavy fire. They got trapped by something. Something happened that made them call a mayday, and it might be pretty hard to get to them. That being said, if we follow the same path that they did, we're probably going to run into that bad situation that they were in. So we need to start looking for alternatives here. Can we make a window? Can we make a door? Can we get in through some other means to actually get to them? Our go-to methods here are going to be drags, and then wall breaches if we need to. So let's watch some drags really quick. This is Polycapo from Estes. going through some of the good techniques here. I've got like this stupid bar, so I can't fast forward through this, but yeah, sorry. So he's basically just, you guys can't hear this, right? So he's talking about, we're just going to show drags and packages. So what he's saying now is if we find a firefighter and they're really close to a door or close to a window, let's not take the time to package them, right? Let's just get them out of the building. If they're in kind of a bad situation deeper into the building, though, this is when we need to start thinking about packaging. Anytime we're going upstairs, going through a window, any kind of long drag, we really need to think about this packaging technique before we start doing anything. And the thought here is to take time in the beginning to save time in the end. So they're going through a push-pull method right now. Really good for kind of like narrow hallways, stuff like that when we all sort of need to be in line. So if you notice how this guy kind of just dove straight into his leg, we really need to get as low as possible so that we can get as much leverage on the bottom of that firefighter. Because if we don't, we're going to be driving their hips straight into the ground, right? And that's creating more friction. That's not what we want. So he's talking about using bigger muscles here, right? If you're dragging like that, you're using your arms, it's not super efficient. If you spin around and put that leg out in front of you, you're using big muscles in your legs, right? You'll be able to drag for longer, you'll be able to have a more powerful drag, and it'll be a more efficient kind of method for dragging them out. So as you can see, works pretty well. Move as a team, talk with your partner. If you're getting to corners, stuff like that, figure out where you're kind of going. So they're going to show you a turn right now. Basically, the concept of this turn would be more of a compact method. So as we were talking about earlier, this is super great for skinny hallways, not taking up a lot of room. So we're going to follow that same thing when we're doing a turn. If we can sit them up, spin them, we kind of decrease the surface area that they have on the ground, the friction. It makes it easier to spin them, to move them around, to put them where we want them. We're going to look at how they use tools in a pack right now. This is not my favorite technique ever, to be honest. But just know it's available to you, and after this one, we'll kind of stop the video. So two pretty good techniques there, right? But that push-pull technique should really be your bread and butter. Again, we talked about packaging. If our firefighter is really close to a door, just grab them and pull them out, or her out. If they're deeper into the building, definitely take the time to package, because it'll save you time down the road. And again, we'll look at what that looks like a little bit later once we start doing hands-on stuff. Questions on at-grade extrication of firefighters? Let's talk about above the ground floor. The first consideration should really be, how are we going to get down, right? Do we have ladders that are thrown up to those windows that we can pull them out to? Do people kind of know that you're going upstairs to get a firefighter? Can they sort of set that up for you? Stuff like that. Stability also comes into play. We talked about this with vertical vent. It's the same idea here, right? We need to be sounding the roof. If we're up there, we need to be sounding floors. If a firefighter called a mayday up there and there's hot conditions, we know that we could potentially be going into something bad. So make sure we're sounding similar to all of the work that we would do up on a roof. In terms of methods, right, we can go out a window if we need to, or we can bring them down the stairs. Some of the window bailout stuff we'll hopefully talk about later. Again, it's hard to sort of discuss what that tactic is, but we do have methods as firefighters to kind of get out of a bad situation in a second story window really quickly and almost like flip onto a ladder if we need to. We'll cover it hopefully more in depth on hands-on stuff. Above ground floor questions. All right, we're going to go through a couple slides on RIT stuff quickly, and then we'll talk about some scenarios. So one of the big kind of hindrances we put on ourselves sometimes as a RIT team is we have so much gear that it makes it really hard to move. It's really beneficial as a RIT team to kind of stage everything out in the front lawn so that we don't have to take everything with us, right? And we can listen to the radio, we can kind of figure out what we actually need to bring into this fire before we go in. So our kind of steps once we actually get to a firefighter are these. So our first step is going to be to deactivate the pass alarm that's going off on the firefighter, right? So typically after you call a mayday and you give your lunar report, you're going to turn on your pass alarm. Again, we'll talk about how to do that once you guys actually have packs on. But the first step as a RIT team, once we get to them, is going to be to actually turn that off. So this does a couple of things, right? The first is that it decreases stress. If we don't have this thing yelling at us the whole time while we're trying to move a firefighter or figure out what we're going to do, it's going to make life a lot easier. To that extent, it also allows us to hear our firefighters more easily. So if we're working on it as a team, we'll be able to listen to what our leaders are saying or what other firefighters are saying and kind of be able to affect this rescue a lot better. Second thing we need to check on is air, right? So the first thing we're going to do is go to the face. So is their mask on? Is their regulator clipped into their mask? And then we're going to move kind of our way down. So after we figure out that their mask is good, their regulator is good, and then we're going to start checking hoses. We're going to look at air in the tank. Because if we get to a firefighter and we forget to check their mask, and then we go ahead and clip up our bottle to their bottle so that they can breathe, we just wasted both of our air, right? Because that's just going to flow out of their regulator if it's not on their face. Again, we're going to talk about those two kind of ways to provide air to a firefighter in person, and I'll hit on them a little bit in the next slide. Packaging we just talked about, but that's that SCBA conversion. If they're far into a building, take time to make time, get them packaged so that we can actually move them out. So that push-pull technique is going to be super powerful. If you want to, you can do that tool drag. If you need to, you can just drag their feet, right? Questions on these steps as a RIT? I know it's quick and it's kind of hard to explain over the computer, but these are the basic steps. All right, so we talked about high pressure and low pressure before. And again, this is probably going to be going a little bit above where we're at right now because you guys haven't had the hands-on for SCBAs. But UAC is a RIT connection. So this is a high pressure solution. And basically what happens is we've got a low pressure, which would be a buddy breathe, and a high pressure, which would be a RIT or a UAC connection. So high pressure solution is taking air from one bottle and basically jamming it into the other, right? Once we do this, our UAC can actually be disconnected. So this is beneficial when we bring our RIT tank into a firefighter. We connect our UAC, we get air into their bottle, and then we can take it off and we can move. The way that that differs from a low pressure solution, which would be like a buddy breather, would be our tanks will equalize once we connect a buddy breather or a low pressure solution because air wants to find its way to low pressure, right? We talked about that in ventilation. So our tanks are going to equalize each other and then we don't have the option of disconnecting. So once we put buddy breathers together, that's it, right? We have to move together as a unit with the victim to get them out of the building. So that can be challenging depending on whatever the situation is when we went in there. So keep that in mind. We talked about checking your victim's air, right? We want to move mask down and then basically figure out what our best solution is. So with the UAC, we can just clip it in, we can fill their bottle, disconnect, and then we can go. After we do that, we need to make sure that that actually worked because if there's a hole in the line and we just filled their bottle with a high pressure solution, now we just lost all of our air. Again, sorry, I know that was a little bit above where we're at with SCBA stuff, but just wanted to give you kind of a heads up as to what that was.
I have a question.
Yeah,
Would that only fill if you had an empty tank and then you're filling it with a full tank, and once they equalize, would it only then be 50% full on each tank afterwards?
yeah, so you're talking about the low pressure solution, the buddy breather?
Yes.
Yeah, so you would have 50% or whatever it is on both tanks. So yeah, I would look to find equilibrium between the two. And keep in mind now you have two people breathing off of one air supply. So yeah, that's a good point. That's something super, super important to keep in mind when you're connecting a low pressure versus a high pressure solution. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that was kind of what I was suspecting, but just making sure.
Cool. Any other questions on this stuff? All right, let's go through a couple scenarios really quickly before I let you go. So again, feel free to go off mute. Let's just call it out here as you see it. So first scenario, dispatch to a working structure fire in a residential wood frame. You show up on scene, this is what you got. We're gonna say this is one bedroom on fire. You're assigned to search with an officer, so it's just you two. You and your officer split on the second floor. So your officer's going into one bedroom, you're going into another. You're calling back to him, he's responding to you, and then suddenly you get super disoriented. You don't know where you are, and your officer isn't calling back to you. So what are we thinking we do in this situation?
Find your way back to whatever your entry point was. So just keep working along the walls.
Yeah, I think that's ideal. Anything else? Anyone else want to jump in before we kind of talk about this a little bit?
I was thinking if you're in a bedroom, there's obviously going to be a window there. Based off of the picture, if it's daylight, I don't think you'd be able to see through the smoke, but you might be able to see light coming in from somewhere. And if that's the case, you know, you might be able to try to reorient yourself based off of what you're seeing out the window. You might be able to tell if you're on like, you know, Bravo or Charlie side or something.
Yeah, that's a good point. So let's look for anything that can give us kind of a clue as to where we're at, right? So kind of our first step here when we get into this situation is to stop, right? We need to start kind of taking inventory of ourselves. So just stop what you're doing, get low, wipe off your face piece, right? Like a lot of the times, if you get into a fire, sometimes your face piece can fog up, sometimes you can get crap all over it. Just wipe it off, make sure that that's not in your way, and kind of gain control of your body again, right? Look for stuff like light coming in through windows, like you were just talking about. Try to figure out kind of where you're at and where you need to move to. And then while you're down there, listen, right? You'll probably be able to hear your officer moving around. Maybe you can hear the truck pumping outside. They're really loud. And maybe that'll give you a better idea of, oh, hey, the truck's behind me. I know I came in on the alpha side. So that means I'm probably facing Charlie, right? Stop, slow down, listen, get low, see if you can see below the smoke, stuff like that. Anyone else have any questions or anything to add on this first scenario? All right, same fire. Let's say you're on the engine. While you're making a push with your officer, you find a victim in the hallway. What do you do?
I think you would call your officer. That way he can assist you. I mean, obviously, depending on the size of the victim, it could be hard for you to do what you need to do by yourself. That would be, I guess, my ideal for me. Would you found a victim? Let's get him out.
Okay. Anyone else?
Would some of where you found the victim depend on where that victim is in location to like the active fire?
Hmm. Yeah. So I think both of you guys are right, right? We kind of have to take note of what's happening around us. Like, do we have a truck company that's coming in, like, as we're making the stretch? If so, maybe we let them know, like, hey, we got a victim up here on this first floor. Maybe if you come across them and the fire conditions aren't super bad and they're pretty small, maybe your officer can just drag them out or get them to a safer position so that you can start putting an attack on that fire, right? At the end of the day, an attack line is going to save more lives than dragging people out of a building. Caveat to that would be if it's quick and it's easy, right? We need to do that. And no matter what, we need to make it better for this victim that's within the building. Um, so yeah, I mean, this is kind of a tough scenario here. If you're by yourself, it's hard to make that decision in terms of um, kind of dropping our attack off in favor of this victim or not. And a lot of stuff is going to play into that. So I think you guys are both right there. I don't know if chiefs or the captains have anything else they want to add into this one. But this is sort of a classic scenario that's really hard to deal with as an engine company or a single operating unit.
I guess I'll just add in
this is
that.
one of those scenarios that.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Okay. I was just going to say, to me, looking at the fire and seeing it's clearly vent limited, probably an attic fire with extension into that delta side, which is the right side as you're looking at it. So part of that is a limited engine company like we'd have in Timberline is prior to hopefully finding that victim would be identifying safe havens and rooms that have been made clear or have no fire conditions in them. So in that scenario, should I find myself alone with the victim, there's a potential that you may find a room, whether that's a bedroom, bathroom, whatever, it's fairly limited fire conditions inside of it. Whether I'd use a shelter in place with the victim by relocating them into that room, or potentially sheltering the victim in place and continuing my search to let the outside crews know to come do a VIS on that target window might be viable given the fact that we have such limited crews up in Timberline, Tommy.
Yeah.
I think this and the scenario before lend itself really well that when we're in a building or in a home on an EMS call and kind of, sitting around not really thinking about too much, waiting for, them to make a decision on whether they're taking the patient or not, just, and even in their own house. As I walk through my own house, if I was making a stretch and we found a victim here and, I create a scenario in my head, you just kind of think about those types of scenarios. The more and more you get into this job and the more and more you shift and more you work with crewmates and, just say to each other, man, what would it be like if we were doing fire tech and we found a victim right here on this real narrow stair or in this back hallway or whatever. Use your imagination to create situations, and that way you'll be able to have a process to think through with your crewmates and in your mind on how to you'll have thought through that scenario before you get to it, and then when you land in it, you'll have some options.
So let's do a few more. I know I'm keeping you guys late again, but it's good stuff. So let's think about getting toned again to a single-story residential woods frame. You're first for arrival, pull line for initial primary. Let's say you got two engines showing up 30 seconds behind you, as typically happens at Timberline. Move in the door, you take 2 steps, and you fall through the floor. You're with whatever, let's just say your officer and an engineer. What are you thinking? Let's start off as if you were the second person backing up on that line. So the firefighter in front of you just fell through the floor. What stuff is going through your head?
Oh shit.
That's a good response, yeah.
I think, and I don't know if there's an order of operations with this one. I would imagine that you would obviously help call a mayday in that situation. You don't know the condition of him when he fell down through the floor, and if he's not calling mayday, it could be, that he may have knocked himself out or something worse. But I think at least in my opinion, I don't know if that would immediately be priority in the situation, or if you would have other people coming in helping you with that, and then obviously continue with the initial search.
Yeah, so some really good points there, right? That is kind of the priority. Once you fall down, or once someone has gone through the floor, we need to get that mayday out, right? Because if you start kind of trying to go get to that victim, it's just not going to come out, and that's going to start leading to chaos. You'll see some of that stuff in that video that I'll send out after this. But we need to make sure that we have other crews coming, and we need to make sure we've got resources that are coming in that can actually help affect a rescue, or basically do the job we need to do, right? We can't forget that we were going in to do an initial primary attack, so that fire is still growing. We also need more resources to now take that line over and go control that fire if we can. So yeah, I think you're absolutely right. We need to get that mayday put out there. And another part of what that does, right, is like if Cap's coming in his Chief's car down the road, that takes all of that pressure off of you, and it kind of gives it to Cap. He can start getting medical resources coming. He can strike a second alarm. He can kind of get a better idea of what engines and what resources are coming behind you, so you can start focusing on how to get this person out of the building. Again, as we know, we're probably not thinking super clearly when this starts to happen. So generally an officer or someone who's outside of the building will have a good idea of where resources are at, and sort of what our next tactical priority is after this has happened. Does anyone else have any other thoughts on this scenario, if you were the backup on this line?
Yeah, Tommy, the first thing I thought was I think probably clinically calling a mayday is the right answer, but what came to mind instantly for me first is like trying to identify where the nozzle went, because if it went with the firefighter down below, part of that is like, is that dude able and trying to suppress the fire in his location? And two, if not, can I get that line up to continue suppression and try to minimize the impact of the fire for the rescue efforts? That'd most likely probably be the first step I'd take, whether that's right or wrong, before I call the mayday. But I think that's a good point, whoever that was that mentioned the comment about first trying to call the mayday, and I think you need those resources quick. But putting the fire out first can minimize a lot of those risks with adjacent units, prior to even getting a mayday crew activated.
Yeah, for
Yeah,
sure.
I would echo what Cap just said.
my mind initially went to, why is there a hole in the floor? There must be fire down there. If he didn't take the nozzle with him, do I need to get the nozzle down to him to create some safe haven for him? And then, hopefully on the 360 we would know the answer, but is that a full basement? Is it a crawl space? What's my potential paths to egress? And start working through immediately after that mayday, start working out your plan A to getting that person out of there.
Totally.
Bad day either way.
Yeah. Cool. All right, let's do one more, and then I'll let you guys go for the night. No, let's not do this one because it's kind of the same thing that we were talking about. All right, so let's pretend that you're assigned RIT. You come in, you got an engine crew and truck crew operating inside the building. You have done your 360, you've gathered your tools, they're laying out on the lawn, and you're kind of just hanging out, ready to go if they need you. Over the radio, you hear Mayday, 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 second floor I'm burning. So first thing here, when you start listening to Mayday traffic, and I really recommend you do, it's not always going to be textbook like we thought about, right? It's going to be like one Mayday and then help or something like that. So this is a realistic, honestly, probably more detail than you're going to get over the radio Mayday call. But if you're assigned to RIT, let's say you're the RIT officer and you hear this coming across the radio, what is going through your mind?
Trying to think about gear I'd need to bring, if it's second floor, start thinking about ladders if you're gonna enter in through that way. Yeah. I'll let someone else.
Yeah, someone else join in to that, and keep in mind the picture that we're looking at here. Imagine that these are the conditions that you're seeing.
I mean, I feel like you gotta it kind of pinpoints where he's at, not necessarily in the exact room or the location in the house, but you obviously know that he's probably upstairs, somewhere in or around those flames. See, I think, I'm not sure who said it, but was right as far as getting a ladder up there. Obviously, we're not too sure on what the condition is, if it burnt through and then out of those, what looks like were windows. Is a condition, well, I don't think it's going to be good enough to go through the house and up there. You might just have to go directly to the windows. But definitely still putting you in a tough spot trying to get in to help if the flames are coming out.
For sure.
Yeah, Tommy, I'd also say, I hope that the RIT team's got a dry hose line with them, but that's probably not the case up in Timberline. Number two, for those of you, if I don't know, I wasn't able to attend last week for fire behavior, but that's clearly a fuel limited fire, meaning that it's got plenty of oxygen to continue burning. So chances are this is post flash, which means that if there was a firefighter on that Charlie side, odds are if he was in one of those rooms, he's probably not surviving. So as a RIT team, I'm trying to look for a target of opportunity, which would be potentially a window that doesn't indicate the same as what you're seeing there. So a blackened out window, or potentially a window that's stable. And I'm going to try to target the windows closest to the seat of the fire that are stable, in hopes of trying to find the firefighter that hopefully sheltered in place behind a closed door.
Yep.
So when Tommy gave you the description, he used one of the terms that I absolutely positively hate. And that's hanging out on the front lawn when you're on RIT. No, there's no disrespect. I'm just like, when you're RIT, you are active. So I'm just, as we teach you guys and bring you into this, I'm just going to soapbox for just a second. When you're RIT, you are not hanging out ever. you are strategically working in your mind what's going on. You're listening to radio traffic. You're listening to the crew assignments and where they're working and how they're making their push, and trying to figure out in your mind exactly where they are in the building. And you're constantly building those scenarios. All right, if they go down now, how do I get them out? If they go down now, how do I get them out? You know, you've already thrown your ladders before this has happened. And you know, you're active to do all the things that Mark talked about on finding an access point and a soft spot to be able to effect a rescue. To be able to do that effectively, you have to be thinking. And a lot of times I position myself on a corner. I'm looking at two sides of the building. I may even split my crew for RIT and have them on four sides of the building if it's a smaller building, so that we can watch all the sides kind of simultaneously. And I'm almost circling the building, really making sure that I have as much information as I can. So as soon as that first Mayday goes out, I've already got maybe a plan A or a half of a plan B in my head to do that. So when you're RIT, you know, some people are like, oh, darn, I'm RIT. I'm not doing anything. I'm sitting out here waiting. No, you're doing more than you think. So just keep that in the back of your mind. It's really important to constantly think, if this goes bad, how can I help? And hopefully you'll be in a spot to have already thought that through and make it happen.
Yeah, definitely a good point. So yeah, like we've kind of been talking about throughout all of these slides, right? A lot of this stuff you don't really need to be on the fire ground to start training on. Start using some of that visualization, start thinking about different scenarios in your house, practicing your breathing, working out and practicing your breathing. It makes a huge difference when your heart rate's actually elevated. Google some pictures of structure fires, stuff like that, and just start imagining scenarios like that. Start looking at windows when you're walking around. Gary Lane, that guy I was talking about before, likes to say creeping, not creepy. So don't like stare into people's houses and try to figure out what's going on inside. But I mean, take note of what you're seeing when you walk down the street, right? Like look for bedroom windows, look for staircases, stuff like that, and start kind of thinking through how you would attack this building if you're on fire attack, if you're on RIT, if you're on search, stuff like that. That's all I got. Email me if you guys want more. All yours, Cap.
Hey, Tom, I put a link in the chat box. I don't know if you can click on that on your side, Tom, and just verify that that's the Mayday. I think that's the Mayday video that you were talking about. So,
Let me see. It's trying. Yeah, this is it.
okay. So if you guys can snag that out of the chat box and just keep that, that's the Mayday video that Tom was talking about. Other than that, I don't have anything. Chief Fondas, do you have anything on your corner?
No. Sorry I was late, Tommy.
This conference will now be recorded.
And you can take it away whenever you're ready. Thanks everyone for showing up. We'll have one or two other people coming in from that call that'll jump in, but we can get started on time.
All right, let's do it. So tonight we're going to go over a lot of stuff. I'm going to try to move relatively quickly. So if I'm going through something and you don't get it, definitely stop me, let me know, and we can go through it. So here's the plan. Take an hour to go through search and victim removal stuff. And then we'll do the second hour to go through survival. I got some scenarios at the end that we can go through too that hopefully will help this sink in a little bit. I gave us a little bit of time in between to give myself enough time to switch over the slide decks. I just made them in 2 decks and get up and get some water, whatever you guys want to do. I'm sure you get sick of hearing me talk. and my ass fell asleep last time, so I'm going to try to avoid that here, and we'll take a little break. So if anyone has any questions before we jump in, let me know. Cool. Like I said last time, if you guys have cameras and you feel comfortable having them on, feel free to throw them on. Helps us out as instructors for sure. But let's get started. So I wanted to open up with a quote from John Salka. He was a battalion chief in the FDNY. He kind of bounced all over the FDNY, honestly, but he spent a lot of time in Rescue 3, so definitely qualified to talk about search. But he was talking about this on a podcast that he has with Rick Lasky. It's called Old School. If you guys are into the podcast scene, that's a good one to check out. But basically, the point that he's trying to drive home here is that the only way that a person can survive being in a burning building is if we go in and get them. And I kind of want to set the tone of that for the night. He typically opens up his classes with a couple of questions. I'll ask them now. They're not really meant for people that are going through the fire academy. They're more so meant for people that have been on the line for a little bit. But I'll throw them out there. You guys might know some of them. Saw Cap Williams was on. Feel free to jump in. Cap Johnson, obviously. I don't know if Bondus is on yet, but if you guys know the answers, let me know. First one was how many firefighters died in 9/11? Does anyone know the answer to that?
343.
Yeah, good work. Second question was how many people, how many victims were in the towers that day that died? Does anyone know that answer? So didn't really expect too many people to know that. 2,753 people. The next question he likes to ask, and I definitely don't expect you guys to know this in the academy, but maybe the captains on the call do. How many LODDs were there last year? And this is kind of a loaded question because there's about 20 different organizations that have different numbers for this. This is why this statistic kind of sucks and is misleading. But anyone have a ballpark on how many firefighters died last year, or for the academy, how many do you think died last year? No one? No takers? All right, 57 LODDs last year for firefighters. And the last question he likes to ask is how many people died in fires. So let me just get a guess from somebody on how many people died in fires last year. And let me preface this with me saying I definitely did not know the answer to this before I heard this podcast and sort of started getting into this way of thinking about search and being a firefighter, honestly. So don't feel like this is something that you should know. But if anyone wants to shoot out a guess, let me know what you think for how many people died in fires last year.
Is
In the
this
United States, right?
Yeah, in the US.
is this civilians or?
This is civilians, yeah, and keep in mind this isn't just structure fire. This is just fire in general. So wildland and stuff like that counts.
All right, I'm gonna say 2,000.
All right. Let's dive
4,000.
into how much. Well, how many was that?
I guess 4,000.
Okay. So let's take a look. And my thing is already not working. There we go. All right. So these are the numbers that we got. And a couple of things that I wanted to highlight here. It was 3,645 in 2017. That's kind of the most up-to-date stats that we have. So the two guesses were good. The one thing I wanted to point out here, though, is this right-handed side, right? This rate. If you look at it, it stayed pretty flat. And honestly, in the last 3 years, it's gotten worse. So this really kind of hits home for us, right? We have to start being better at what we do. This is not really super acceptable that in the last 10 years, it stayed flat and it's even started to get worse. We really have to start putting more emphasis on our search training and our culture as firefighters, right? This is our job to go in and protect lives and property. And if we're not putting an emphasis on that, we're not really doing our job and we're not living up to the public's expectations. So just let these numbers kind of sink in a little bit. I sort of wanted to use this to set the stage for the rest of the class tonight. Any questions on John or Rick Lasky or any of these numbers before we start diving into this stuff? Cool, let's get going. So the first thing I wanted to talk about was where are victims. So in the last couple of years, a lot of people started hopping on this idea of, look, we're not really giving the citizens the best chance to survive. And one of the big drivers behind that was we track all of our LODDs so meticulously, and this has been done forever. But we don't really track where we find victims in fires. So in the past couple of years, the Fire Rescue Survey has started tracking this, and people can kind of go onto their website and tell them where they found victims. They take all that data, they put it together, and they push it out to the public. So this is basically what it looks like. If you're counting the numbers there, it definitely doesn't add up to 100%. The reason for that is I kind of wanted to just display what this looks like in a bedroom. So these are the percentages of where people are found as it relates to a bedroom. The reason why I picked bedroom was because 50% of the victims are found in a bedroom. So 9% of the victims that we find are going to be right beneath a window or super close to it. 12% are up on the bed, 1% underneath it, 4% are on a chair, couch, love seat, something like that. And then 39% of the people that we find are on the floor. So what does this really mean for us, right? Well, it means a couple of things. One, it has an impact on how we actually search, our patterns, how we move around a room, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. The second thing that it means is we have to get really good at picking people up off the floor. And we're really not going to hit on that tonight. And the reason for it is that it's going to wash right over your head if we don't have time to practice it. So we're going to talk about how to move around a room. We'll talk about some basic concepts of search. And I promise you, once we start moving into hands-on stuff, we're going to go over this ad nauseum until you guys are really good at it. But this is basically going to drive how we are going to train on search. We'll place victims there as much as we can, and we'll get really good at picking people off of the floor because that's typically where we're going to find them. If you're curious about all of the other numbers in terms of where we find people, these are them. I don't really want to dwell on this slide too much because there's a ton going on here. But if you guys want to know more about the survey, if you want more data, let me know. I'll shoot it out to you, and you can kind of comb through it if you want. Just one last slide on data before we kind of dive into some of the tactics that we're going to use in search. So this slide talks about basically what happened when we got to scene and when we were going to scene. So this is talking about reports that we got of victims, of people out, of no victims, stuff like that. And the interesting part about this is less than half the time people are right. So we really need to be careful about calling something off or saying something isn't survivable. We really need to kind of get into the mindset of everything is occupied until we've proven otherwise as the fire department. So keep this in mind when we start kind of responding to calls or when we start doing training. We'll try to throw some of this realistic stuff in at you, but we really do need to lay back on our principles of everything is occupied until we say otherwise, and we need to be in there and searching because that's really our duty to the public. That's why we're here. So any questions on any of this data stuff before we start diving into some tactics?
So those percentages for the bedroom, are those unconscious victims or are those people who are still aware and able to act on their own?
Yeah, it's a good question. So there are statistics on how people presented when we found them. This is just when people found victims in general. So they may have been conscious, they may have been unconscious. if you want, I can show you some of the data in terms of how that breaks down. But we can typically kind of pull out of this a couple of different things, right? We know that people are more likely to be unconscious if they're higher up in a room, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But at the same time, we kind of have to assume that people are going to be unconscious, right? Because people want to be out of a house. Like no one wants to be sitting in their bedroom while their house is on fire. So if you're finding victims, a lot of the time they're probably going to be unconscious and naked and weigh 400 pounds. But good question. We can kind of dive deeper into that if you want to in a little bit. Did that answer your question? I'm sorry, it wasn't really like a direct answer.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Cool. Anything else on data stuff? All right. So just like I was talking about last week, I like kind of starting some of this stuff with our size up, specifically for search, honestly, because we can almost search a building before we even go into it in the first place. So let's talk about it a little bit. And again, this is going to kind of start layering on some of the stuff we were talking about with the vent last week as well. So our basic layout, residential doors, which way do they open? Does anybody know? Most of the time in Colorado, I should preface that with.
Inward?
Yeah, inward. So the way that I like to think about this is in Colorado, we get a lot of snow, right? So if it snows a ton, people are going to be able to open the doors outward if there's a ton of snow piled up against it. So that's how I like to remember it. Commercial doors are going to swing the opposite way. The reason for that is fire code. So if you got a packed building and people need to get out in a fire, they can just run out of a door as opposed to having to pull it open and block that kind of lane of travel for a little bit. Back to that front door in general, though. When we open that front door, where is that typically going to flow into in residential homes? Anybody have an idea?
A living space?
Yeah, I'd say it's probably safe to bet that within the first 2 rooms that you come into contact with after opening the front door, one of them is going to be a living room, right? We're probably going to have a little mud room or some sort of entry room, whatever you want to call it. And then there's typically going to be a living room right off of that. We're usually not opening the front door into someone's bedroom or into a bathroom, right? So think about basic layout stuff like that. Another good one I like to think about is bedrooms. So if we're on a 2-story house, right, our bedrooms are typically going to be on the top floor. In ranch style homes, they're usually going to be split out to the wings when we have a door in the center of the layout. If a door favors one side, they're typically going to be on the opposite side of the house. So start thinking about stuff like that when you're kind of walking around the neighborhood or just looking at your own home, honestly. Windows, let's use this as a little bit of a test here because we hit on a lot of this last week. So large bay windows are typically going to be indicative of what? We're not super talkative tonight, I guess.
Living room.
Yeah, living rooms, right? Small windows, frosted glass, any kind of weird windows like that, typically going to be bathrooms. Usually windows around 3 feet high are going to be bedrooms, stuff like that. So keep that in mind. Some of the newer stuff that we didn't really talk about last week is what the actual windows are presenting like. So if we're looking at the windows and they all seem clear, we're typically talking about less than 160 degrees behind the windows. Once we start moving up a little bit hotter than that, up to around 200 or 190 degrees, we're usually going to see kind of like condensation on the windows. They're going to look wet. Really hot inside of a building, we're going to see black cracked windows, stuff like that. So just kind of feed all of this into your situational awareness of what is going on, and all your decision making when it comes to taking your 360, or even when you're just getting set up in the front lawn. Basements, we don't really have to hit on this too much, but they are super important to know that they exist, right? So make sure you get that information from your officer who's doing the 360 if you're not doing one with him. Is there a basement? Is it a walkout? Is that where the fire's at? All of that could dramatically change the tactics that you use when you go into that building to search. Situational awareness is huge in terms of search. This can tell us a whole lot. So this kind of goes back to that stat on the slide before this about reports that we get from people. So if we roll up and mom says that everyone's out of the house, but we see toys in the front lawn, for instance, and we don't see a kid outside, that should probably get our wheels spinning. We don't ever want to think that a mom would forget their kid inside of a house, but it happens. So keep that in mind, right? Time of day, weather, stuff like for sale signs in the front lawn. If we're responding to a structure fire at 3 o'clock in the morning, people are probably sleeping. They're probably in their house. If it's noon on a Tuesday, they're probably out at work. Again, not a reason to not go into the house and search, but just stuff that should kind of feed into your decision making before you get in, and kind of your mental picture of what you're walking into. One of the big things that I wanted to hit on here was nasty hazards. I don't think we have a lot of window bars up in Timberline, but that's something that you guys should be aware of if you see them, know how to attack them, or at least let somebody know that they exist. Barricaded doors, false roofs, stuff like that. And then the last one, which we definitely do have up in Timberline's district and in everybody's district, is hoarder conditions. Anybody know any telltale signs of hoarder conditions before we even get inside of a house?
Hoarding outside of the house.
Yeah, that's probably the biggest one, right? Hoarding is typically going to start spilling out onto the front porch, into the front lawn. We're typically going to have a view of that before we start even getting close to the house, right? Another one, if you're doing your 360, you're typically not really going to be able to see in most windows because stuff's going to be stacked up. Look for stuff like that so that when you open the front door and there's just tunnels of stuff going through the house, you're not super surprised. That makes for really difficult searching conditions. It might change our tactics because it's really hard to have an attack team trying to make the push while we also have a team of 3 kind of trying to bump in behind them and do a search, right? Not to mention bumping into stuff and getting buried underneath whatever is in that house. The last point here is smoke. I know I promised you guys last week we were going to talk about that, so we will on the next slide. Before we go on to that, I just wanted to hit on the tick a little bit. So that picture on the right, you guys know what a tick is, right? And basically what it does, or have we not covered that yet?
I don't think we've covered that yet. So you want to throw out a few things?
Yeah, let's do it. So the tick on the right, I'm sure you guys know kind of like the basic gist of it, right? It's thermal imaging camera. We basically use it in searches to hopefully pick up differences in temperature. So the thought here is that we'll be able to see people on the tick. We'll be able to see where hot spots are in a house, on a roof, whatever it is. The tick works, I like to think, as a camera. So I like to think that when you're holding the tick up, it takes a really quick picture and it sends it back to you, whatever it sees. The reason I like to think about it like this is because you can outrun the tick if you start moving too fast. And I know this probably doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you've never played around with a tick before, but we'll practice with them a little bit so you guys will kind of see what I'm saying here. But when I like to move with a tick, I typically move in the same pattern every time, right? So I'm going to look up, I'm going to look down, I'm going to go to the right, and I'm going to come around and across my body. And the reason why we go to our right is because we read from left to right. So our brain is typically more comfortable looking at information from left to right. So if we force ourselves to move to the right, we slow everything down and then we avoid outrunning the tick. Again, that will make more sense once you guys start holding a tick, but I wanted to hit on that. And I wanted to hit on one more point here too, is that our tip training in the fire service typically sucks. So this picture that you have on the right is a solid example of that. This is not what it's going to look like in a fire, right? We tend to just throw people into burn buildings, or we just look in cold smoke, stuff like this, and it doesn't really give us a good idea of what heat signatures look like and what differential and heat looks like. So people are not going to stand out like huge white objects on a tick in a structure fire. They're helpful, but it's a tool. It's not really an end all be all. They can't see through stuff like glass. They can't see through water. Carpets can typically hide a thermal signature from the tick. So they are super powerful, but again, don't put all your eggs into the tick basket. Questions on size up, ticks, anything like that before we start talking about smoke behavior quickly?
Hey, Tom, Firefighter Williams threw out in the chat box there that there's significant security bars in Black Hawk and Central City.
Oh,
so
cool.
to the class, why is that a concern to us as firefighters when we get to a building and we're either going to try to put out a fire or operate inside a building?
I think it's meant to keep people out, but in a situation where people are trying to get out, it's trapping them inside.
Excellent. Yeah. So it's that reverse aspect for ourselves when we're inside. So calling those out and even just saying it on the radio so everyone hears it is increases that situational awareness so that we can start either what we call softening the building, if there's really a fire in there, to give some egress points or at least start to work on those security bars, or at least know about them in advance so that we can operate, or get some equipment there to specifically address that. Thanks. Mark?
Can I add one thing? Okay.
Yeah.
You guys can hear me, right? Oh, okay. The other thing to add in that Tommy was talking about in relation to ticks is at Timberline, we have two different versions of ticks. On engine 55, 54, 51, and 58, we have what's called tactical ticks. And then on some of the support vehicles and command units, we have what's called situational ticks. Those are essentially, they're made by a company called Sleek, and we have the Reveal model. So if you think back to like 2004, when you used to have digital cameras that had floppy drives that would take the picture, and that was the quality you were looking at, for those who remember digital cameras when they were very infant, versus maybe like a Nikon, like 810 that's like super brand new and has ultra high resolution and refresh rates. That's really what we're talking about here. So the slide that you're looking at right now is an example of our P40s. That's what we carry on most of our frontline engines, and those are actually about 4 or 5 years old now. So what Tommy was talking about in regards to ticks really not telling you always the full image, when you add on to that extremely reduced resolution, very slow refresh rates, and very small essentially screens, it even contracts down even further the ability of those ticks. So as we move forward and in your career, and as we get more technologically advanced, we tend to focus on our ticks because our minds tell us to do that, when in fact oftentimes the ticks are misleading us often. So I really ask you to take stock in Tommy's comments relating to what you're seeing here as an image of like the picture perfect identification of a person inside of a structure. Most likely that's training smoke, and there's very low temps in there. It's probably on the backside of a burn room. That is absolutely not what you're going to see inside of a real structure fire. So when we get the opportunity to demonstrate that with you down the road, those will be things we'll be pointing out to you. But again, just it's really important to remember ticks are not the solution to a proper search of a room.
Totally. Questions on that and anything else on ticks? All right, let's talk about smoke. Smoke is going to become super important to you. This really is the building's way of telling you what it's doing before it actually does it. It takes a long time to get good at reading smoke. It takes a lot of practice, and we can practice that forever. There's tons of pictures on Google. There's tons of YouTube videos. So there's a lot out there if you guys want to practice it. We're not really going to go through this whole chart. It's here. Take a look at it right now. This is from Dave Dotson. He puts together a program called Reading Smoke. It's amazing. If you want more information on it, let me know. And maybe we'll even do a class on this in the future. But one of the main things that I wanted to point out here is he's got a term which he calls black fire. So black fire is when we see high volume, super turbulent, super dense black smoke pushing out of a building. And this is typically going to be a sure sign of impending flashover. So I know you guys did fire dynamics Tuesday, I think, and we talked about it a little bit last week, but this is a super important thing to know. So if you start to see fire kind of chugging out of a building, this is one of our major warning signs that we have to sort of reevaluate what we're getting ourselves into, and make sure we've got hose lines in place and that we're being smart and tactical about our approach to attacking this fire. That's the 2 slides I got on size up. So if anybody's got questions on size up, reading smoke, anything like that, let me know. Sweet. So we'll get into the 4 L's. This is something that Kev Williams wanted to kind of push in on us on VES, and I like it. It's something that we need to start doing. So this combined with our door procedure, which we're going to talk about in a second, are 2 things that we should really have in the back of our mind before we start going into any room, any building, anything like that. So 4 L's, right? Life, lift, location, and layout. So first of all, is there anything that tells me that there's life in this room? Generally, hearing is going to be our biggest go-to here. So before we go into a room, we want to typically call out, see if anyone calls back to us, but look around, listen. Is there anything that tells us that there's victims down the hall from us, in a bedroom, anything that we might have missed? Lift, we kind of talked about last week a little bit, but what's the fire doing, right? Is it lifting up and out? Is it banking down on us? Are things generally getting better? Are they getting worse? What's happening with the fire? Location is where am I in relation to the building? So we talked about exposures a little bit last week, Alpha Bravo Charlie Delta. Where am I at in this building? Am I on the B side? Am I on the D side? Am I on the AB corner? Where's the engine at? Stuff like that. Get a typical idea before you go into a room of where that room is actually located within the building. And then finally, the layout. What is the space that I'm going into, right? How is it kind of chunked out with furniture? We'll talk about furniture in a little bit, but how much room do I have to kind of move around once I get into there? So be assessing your 4 L's in combination with this door procedure every time that we're going into a building, right? So typically we want to open a door, force a door, whatever, and we want to yell, Timberline Fire, anybody in here? Fire department, where are you? Something like that that gives victims a chance to respond to us. After you yell that, wait. Just sit there and listen. If you want to, this is a great time to start assessing those 4 L's that we just talked about. But this is typically going to be our best chance to hear where victims are at before we even get into a building. Sweeping with a gloved hand. So we're going to kneel down, sweep right in front of us with our hand. And we're doing that for a couple of reasons, right? First is obviously just to make sure that there's a floor there. But more importantly, the second is to make sure there's not a victim there. So Unfortunately, there have been a couple of cases of firefighters going to sound a floor and actually burying an axe or a Halligan through somebody who is sitting there. So we want to make sure that there's nobody there before we start to go on to that step 4, which is aggressive sounding. So quick sweep with your gloved hand, sound aggressively. So we're going to make sure that that floor is solid underneath us before we start going in, or doing step 5, which is the layout. So the layout after we sound, we're going to hook our boot on the jamb of the door, layout, and then we're going to just arc around that door. So we're going to start from one side, move to the other, feel behind the door. That is super important, especially up at Timberline. I think our only fire fatality was someone who's behind a door. So we have to make sure that we start getting in the habit of doing this anytime we're going into a building. Next slide's got some pictures on what the layout looks like. And then after we do that, we're going to enter. So this is kind of what I'm talking about, right? We've got our ankle kind of hooked on the door jamb, that picture on the left, and then we're going to physically lay down on the floor and kind of shuffle across in an arcing motion so that we can feel everything before we're right about to go in. There's a victim right there, sweet. Grab them, pull them out really quick, get the job done, right? So we're making sure there's nobody within that kind of 5-6 feet right before we enter that we can just grab really quick before we commit an entire team inside. Questions on the 4 Ls, the door procedure, anything like that? All right, let's talk about searching. So we got primary and secondary search, 2 very different things. Tonight we're going to focus mostly on primary. And what that is a down and dirty rapid search, right? You want to get into the house, get into every room and search quickly, but efficiently, kind of everything we can. So I kind of like to stay away from the term fast here because it typically lends people to thinking about rushing. We definitely don't want to rush a primary search, but we need to move quickly. So make sure you get in, touch everything that you need to, and get out. So primary is super important for us to get done the first time. Secondary is to come back in. This is when we're thorough and calculated. This is complete. There's really no excuse for missing anything on a secondary search. So primary is coming in when an engine is making the stretch. Secondary is going to be kind of sweeping in after everything has started to settle down a little bit. So we've got a good handle on the fire. We're starting to vent stuff out, and we're kind of just combing through with a second set of eyes to make sure that we didn't miss anything. 2 very different things. Again, tonight we're going to talk about primary, so make sure you definitely read this chapter in your book. And I'll give you some stuff on secondary, but like I said, we're going to mainly focus on primary. Questions between the difference in these 2? All right, so for tactics, let's talk about positions and tools really quick. So to preface kind of the rest of these slides, we're just going to go ahead and assume that we're a dedicated search crew. We got on scene, the engine's already making the push, right? And we're riding 3. So we were assigned to go in and do a search. We don't have to worry about putting water on the fire or anything like that. That's already kind of under control. So we've got our officer, a firefighter, and an engineer. The officer's job here in the search is kind of to take a bigger picture view, sort of similar to everything else that the officer does, right? We want the officer to be aware of the orientation, how much time we have, and what's happening around us. So when we're talking about time, we're talking about 2 different things. So primary would be air, secondary would be fire conditions, and those might flip at some point. So we need to make sure that our crew has enough time in terms of air to move around, do a search, and get back out. Search is typically quick moving, as we talked about before, so it takes a lot of air, especially if you're not super trained on it. Fire conditions, this is something that everyone really needs to be aware of, and a couple of ways that we can start to kind of get a picture of what's happening with this fire, right, is first through our 4 Ls, anytime we come into a room, is stuff getting better? Is it getting worse? That's that lift. The second would be something like sticking your hand up in the air. So I'm not talking about like taking off your glove or anything like that. Literally just raise your hand. If you can raise your hand and it feels good, you're not really in any pain, any discomfort, sweet, we can keep moving. If you get into a different room, you raise your hand up and it's so hot that you have to physically yank your hand down off the ceiling, we know we're starting to run out of time in terms of fire stuff. So keep stuff like that in mind. For you as the firefighter, you're really kind of be doing the grunt work here. So you're moving, you're feeling, this needs to be quick, right? For a primary, I guess just to give you guys kind of like a timeline of what's happening, a typical 2-story residential, and feel free to correct me if you guys think otherwise. But the second floor should typically be cleared in around 5 minutes in terms of getting into bedrooms, quick primary searches of everything. So as a firefighter, you need to be moving and you need to be moving quickly but methodically. Engineer, if you have a third with you, well, we'll talk about splitting in a second, but if you have a third with you, right, this is great. You can kind of just throw them into the mix. We can talk about how they kind of fit into some of the positions in a few slides, but a second option is splitting. And that's what I have down there. I won't hit on it too much, but basically what this means is if we can get this search done with 2 and say the engine company needs an extra person on the line, they can split off and go hang out with them if we don't need them to be on search. But if we need 3 and the engine company is doing great, we can kind of steal them. So tools, couple of tools that we would use in a search. First is the irons. This is probably going to be the most common tool that you have, right? So a flat-headed axe and a Halligan. Super helpful for searching. They're relatively light. They're small tools. We'll talk about how to use them in a second here. The water can is also pretty important. I wouldn't say that this should take the place of irons, but it's a great addition to that. You can use it to cool and reset the environment if you need to. It's also super big and bulky, so you can put it at the door and it's something that you'll bump into and you'll know that you're back at the door if you need it. Webbing and cordage is great to have. They can make great tools for getting bigger people out of rooms. You'll get to know which one you feel more confident with. Quick note on webbing and cordage though, honestly, people don't use them. So if you come across a victim, you're probably going to be dragging them out with your hands. So that's really what I would like to hit on in terms of searching stuff. Will definitely get you guys to know how to use your webbing and how to use it effectively. But most of the time, we're just going to go back to hands-on victim and we're going to get them out of a room. You should have webbing and cordage with you, but definitely keep that in mind. So a couple of notes on the tools. When we're moving around with like a flat-headed axe, if you look at that picture on the left, that's typically how we want to hold it. So we don't want to be swinging an axe around outside of us. So hold on to the blade of the axe, swing around the handle, right? A note on swinging around tools, also, it's going to be a lot easier to tell if you're hitting a victim with your hands than if you're hitting a victim with the handle of an axe, right? So whenever we can, we need to have hands on people. That's super important if we're extending into a room, which would be that picture on the right. And that's picture didn't really come out as well as I wanted it to. But the basic premise there is that if we're trying to extend out of a wall, it's a lot better to do that picture on the right than the picture on the left. And the difference there is that we put our tool against the wall and we physically stretch out into the room if we need to and feel with our hands as opposed to the other way around. So whenever you can, we want to make sure we're getting hands on victims, hands on objects, so we can make that decision of whether they need to come out or whether it's a pile of clothes. Anyone have questions on positions, tools, how to use them, webbing, cordage, anything like that?
Just a kind of a quick question. I don't know if this is something that's going to be covered a little bit later on, or how common it is, I guess, to have like a search line. I know in one of the other chapters that we read, that was, I think it was in Rope and Knots, that it talked about a search line. Is that pretty commonly used for search situations?
Yeah, so we're going to talk about search lines a little bit later, but we'll just hit on it now. Search lines are used when we do large area searches, right? So they're super effective if we're going into like a warehouse or something like that. The way that they're typically set up, we'll have a rope bag and there'll be knots or carabiners or something every 20 feet, every 50 feet, however the department has it set up. And really the reason for search lines is orientation and to know how far you've gone into a building and how far you have to get out. Um, they don't really have a place in residential search, to be honest. It's too small of a space. It's going to get tangled with the engine company making the stretch. But super important for large area searches, warehouses, commercial buildings, casinos and Blackhawks, stuff like that. I don't know if anyone wants to add anything on search ropes or large area there, but we'll cover it in a few slides. Did that answer the question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cool. Got anything else on positions, tools, anything like that? All right. Some of the tactics, we'll talk about movements. I don't know why my face looks so weird in that picture, but whatever. That's typically the position we want to be in when we're moving around in the search, and we call that the tripod. So typically fire academies have taught crawling on hands and knees. That's great, but you move really freaking slow, and if we want to actually clear a room or a floor in 5 minutes, it's not going to get the job done. With that being said, that first bullet there, conditions dictate. If you can walk in a room, then walk. But don't be like some macho person who's standing up in 1,000-degree heat, melting your helmet. That's not really helping anybody out. So if you can walk, do it. If you can't, do this tripod. A couple more benefits of this tripod to kind of sell it a little bit. Not that I need to, but A is the speed, which we already talked about. B, we have better communications. I know Cap Johnson was sending out some Fairfax radio studies a little bit earlier in the year, but they kind of talk about how positioning of the radio actually does matter. Being up in a tripod position like that helps that. Another reason is that we can feel in front of ourselves, right? So when we're moving through a room, if there's a hole in the floor, if there's something in front of us, we're typically going to be in a better position to A, feel it, and B, do something about it if we actually start falling through the floor. It's a lot easier to kind of save yourself if you're up and in this tripod position than it would be if you're crawling. The final point to kind of hit on here for the tripod is that we're typically oriented to hearing people speak when our face is up like this. So if someone yells down a hallway, it's going to be a lot easier for us to determine, hey, that's down the hall and to the left if our face is up than if we're looking down at the ground, right? Because we don't typically talk to people like that. It might seem like a small thing, but when you're crawling around in a fire and everything, all your systems are running on high, it can help out a lot. That's a big thing from Gary Lane, who's a name I'm sure you guys will hear a little bit more down the road. Two hands on everything, we've already kind of hit on a little bit, but this is super important, right? It's really hard to determine whether you're touching a pile of clothes or a person with an axe blade or with an axe handle. So what we'd like to do is put your tool down and kneel on it. This has also been sort of a sacrilegious thing in the fire service for a little bit, and it kind of started to show itself in the wildland world. I don't know if Bondus is on yet, but I'm not super into the wildland side of things. I like it. But basically, I don't know if you guys have done it or not yet, but we talk about entrapments every year when we have to do our wildland training. I guess earlier in the wildland world, people were dying a lot in entrapments, and they were finding that when they actually found these people who were getting burned up, they were found with all of their tools and everything. So they made a change to all of the stuff that we learned in Wildland, which says first thing that you do when you're running away from a fire is drop all of your gear and grab your fire shelter, right? Um, that was really hard for firefighters to start kind of coming around to because they were so conditioned to never leave your tool. Um, that also pertains to the structural side of things too. We always want to go into buildings with tools. We always want to have our tools near us. But if we need to feel something, just put your tool down and kneel on it. Or if you need to climb up on a bed, put it down, but know where you can kind of come back to it. So don't be afraid to put a tool down to kind of feel up on something. That's what that picture up top would be. Inward versus outward search is easier to show in a picture, which will be the next slide. So I'll talk about that there. And then some of the orientation stuff I kind of wanted to hit on. First point, guys, is people just straight up aren't that interesting. Like you'll start to kind of see this when you start going into a lot of different houses. And now that I've said it, I'm sure you guys will start to kind of take stock of stuff. But people typically lay out their homes in the same way, right? We've got the same kind of furniture and the same type of rooms, and houses are typically built kind of the same. So, like for example, I would be willing to bet that if I open the door to your bedroom, there'd be a window directly opposite on the opposite wall. So stuff like that, keep in mind because when you're searching, it can kind of come into play here. If you're feeling around and you feel a window in a room, that may mean you're opposite from the door. Or if you're kind of like downstairs, don't really know what room you're at, you feel a TV, hey, I'm in the living room. I know that if I turn around 180 degrees, I'm probably going to hit a couch or a chair or something, and I'm going to run into a coffee table on the way, right? So start thinking about stuff like that because people typically like to set up everything the same. Mapping the room, we just kind of talked about what furniture, how that plays into this whole thing. But counting corners here is also super important. So if we get into a bedroom, right, a typical bedroom is usually going to have 4 corners. We could have a big walk-in closet, something like that, but a typical bedroom, if we're counting corners and we've hit 3 corners, we know it's probably going to be better to just stay along that wall if we need to get out quickly than it is to reverse and try to go out the same way. So try to keep stuff like that in mind and kind of put all of it together. So that's what that kind of thing at the bottom is about. If we remember when we walked into a room or when we got into a room, we're feeling along the wall, we felt the bed, we checked the bed, then we hit a nightstand, then we hit a corner, then we hit another corner, and now we're disoriented and hey, we just hit a nightstand. Think back to when we first came into that room, right? There's probably a bed next to it, and then that's the door that I came out. So we know that which way kind of leads to the door we just came in. Does all that stuff kind of make sense? Cool. So again, this is from Kev Williams and VES stuff. And again, my face looks freaking weird here. I don't really know what happened, but whatever. So inward versus outward is basically how we would position ourselves in different sized rooms. So smaller rooms we're typically going to be on that picture on the left. So inward style of searching, we're going to be up against the wall because we don't have to span as far out into the center. Bigger rooms we're typically going to be in the outward style. This allows us to kind of get more into the center of the room and really feel around everything that's going on there. I don't know, Mark, if you want to add anything to this picture, but these are the 2 basic kind of postures that you would take in a room.
Yeah, thanks, Tommy. So you might be asking, well, why? Like if you look at the picture on the right and you just think about position inside of a room and searching someone with your hands, you might say, well, why would I change that? Because the one on the right seems like the best in both worlds, whether it's a large room or a small room. The point of that is, like, when you get into a pretty hot structure in a box that's really hard to see, your anchor point becomes your wall, because that's where you really tell, do I have doors that extend into a Jack and Jill type bathroom? Is this a closet? Is this leading to a second hall? And then more importantly, are there windows next to my shoulder or above me? Are there door handles, etc.? So arguably the left-sided photo is for anchor points and for finding your way through a low visibility search operation is more advantageous to being oriented to your structure. However, we try to in the primary search think of it as like we want to try to do this as quick and as advantageous as possible to having the best tools and the best position. So when you get into the weeds of it, it really does kind of depend on the layout of the room. The other part of that too is with a small room, think of a bathroom or a closet, you're not typically going to have a lot of obstructions against long walls like you would in a larger room, beds, couches, anything that may be present inside of that room. So, you know, by having the right posture inside of those larger rooms, think larger master bedrooms, kid rooms, or living rooms, it allows you to work around those obstructions much quicker and maintain to some degree your hands where they need to be. So as we move through search and rescue in later portions of the academy, you'll find your tripod position does kind of dictate, or it's dictated depending on the size of the structure. So again, this is kind of getting in the weeds and a little bit past where we should be for didactic portion. But I like that Tommy points it out, because when the instructors are looking at you in the rooms, we will kind of be critical about the posture you're in depending on the size of the room.
Thank you. So just two quick videos on what that actually looks like if they want to load. So here's the inward. So I probably should have been hitting my boot a little bit harder, but basically it gives us an ability to feel a little bit out in front of us, and we can move relatively quickly, right? Here's that outward search. Again, we can move quickly and we can hold another tool in our hand if we need to while we're moving. Questions about inward versus outward, tripod, anything like that? Cool. All right. So to get into kind of some of the patterns and priorities, again, this is not really going to make a whole lot of sense until we start feeling it out for real. But I kind of wanted to just give us a brief overview of what we're going to be dealing with here. So right-handed versus left-handed, right? This is pretty self-explanatory. When we come into a room, I guess let me back up. When we first come into a room, let's start thinking about the room as a box. So every pattern that we have is about a different way of covering surface area within that box. So our right-handed search, right, we're going to go into that room and we're going to move to the right. And all of the corners that were hit, we're going to go around in like a counterclockwise motion. Left-handed search is left-handed. So we're going to go in, we're going to take a left, and then we're going to go around in a clockwise motion. Split search is basically done when we've got high level of comfort with our partner that we're searching with, when we've got higher visibility. Mark and I were kind of talking about this right beforehand, but the split and the oriented could be argued to be the same thing. The difference here is that the split search allows more room in between firefighters. So an oriented search would look like officer waiting at the door, firefighter goes into the room, does a quick search. Maybe the officer is sitting there with a tick and he says, hey, you missed a window over there, you missed a wall over here. He can kind of direct. So split would be officer going into the bedroom on the left, firefighter going into the bedroom on the right. Again, that's kind of a higher level tactic and it's going to take a lot of comfort. So we won't really hit on that too much. The next one I have there is the bounce. I like doing this. There's probably a better name for it, but I like to call it the bounce. So it's sort of a combination of a right-handed and a split or an oriented search. So we're typically going to come into a room. Officer's going to hang out on the wall. They're going to be feeling along that wall, typically in an inwards position. So they're feeling for windows, for doors, for whatever. And then the firefighter is going to be kind of like zigzagging out off of the officer, bouncing into the center of the room, making sure they can feel everything that's happening on the floor throughout that building. VES, we're not going to talk about too much tonight, but I wanted to let you guys know it exists. This is basically searching a room off of a ladder. And then there's our large area search bullet. So this is going to be search off a line. We talked about it a little bit, but the thought here is that if we're going into huge open warehouses with a lot of floor space, we want to give ourselves a way to know how far in we've come, because it can get super disorienting when we're in an enormous warehouse and we don't know where our way out is or how far we've got. So we really want to make sure that we have some way of being aware how much time we need to get back out of the building. Door markings, if we're talking about doing searches, not necessarily in a fire, but something like a CO alarm or some kind of hazmat thing at a casino in Blackhawk or something like that, somewhere where there's a lot of rooms, we can use door markings like a piece of tape to show that we have searched a room so that we don't have to go back and search it again. We're typically not going to be taking the time to do this on like a primary search in a fire, but something that would be useful for like a CO call or some bigger call with a lot of rooms that need to be searched. We don't want to backtrack on our efforts. Questions here on any of these patterns before we start talking about the priorities a little bit? And again, this should make a little bit more sense once you guys can actually see it, but any questions? Sweet. So the priorities, this is basically getting into some of the mindset stuff that we're going to talk about in a little bit. But this is kind of thinking about, well, we've got this huge house, where do we even start, right? So the first should be a known location. So if we've got mom screaming that her kid is in the second floor bedroom on the right, we should probably get someone in there as soon as we can, right? If we don't have any reports of anything, we're going to work from the fire back. The thought here is that we want to move from the least tenable space to the most tenable space. So if we get close to the fire, we'll be able to pull victims out who might be in a worse spot than someone who's maybe on a different floor or in a different area of the house that isn't as badly impacted. The caveat to this here is that we need to make sure that we have either lines coming, lines in place, or some way to handle this fire if it actually starts to get bad on us, because we don't have protection of water, so we really need to be careful with this. After that, right, bedrooms, we already kind of talked about this a little bit, are going to be sort of the most likely place to find victims. Living rooms are also a fun place that people like to hang out in fires. Once we can kind of tie this into the patterns, again, it should make more sense. But do we have questions at all on patterns, priorities, anything that we've hit on so far? Alrighty. So some of the mindset that I kind of talked about a little bit earlier, but this is in terms of us, right? So the first thing that we always have to have whenever we're getting into a building to do a search is the expectation of victims, right? We can't fall victim to someone saying there's no one in the house. We can't fall victim to people saying, oh, well, it's just another automatic alarm, right? This stuff will start to pop up as you get further into your career here, and it'll start to seem more normal. Don't let it happen to you, right? We need to expect victims anytime that we're going into a structure, and we really can't let our guard down on this one. Orientation is also super important. So we've kind of talked about this, but just to hit it again, right? Where am I in a room? Do I know how many corners I've gone so far? How many corners do I have to like get out? Probably. Where am I at in the building, right? Am I on ABC side? Where's the engine? Where did I come in? Where have I gone so far? What's my quickest way to get out of this room, right? If stuff goes bad, is there a window that I just felt that I could potentially get out? Is the fastest way to come back from where I came? And then more importantly, probably would be when I do find this victim, where am I going to take them? So it's one thing to find the victim. The next thing would be to figure out how to most efficiently get them out of a room, right? So sometimes the way we came in is not always going to be the most advantageous way to come out. And we'll talk about that in this next section here. But think about kind of where you could bring people, or where you're going once you find someone. Time, again, we've talked about this, air and fire. How much air do I have left in my SCBA? How much air do I need to get out? Do I know how much air I actually use in a structure fire? All that stuff we'll talk about in survival in a little bit. And then the fire, right? What's happening with the fire? Is it getting better? Is it getting worse? How is my crew doing in there? Are we able to keep moving quicker? Or do I need to give them more time to get out? Questions on mindset stuff. Cool. A few slides I wanted to talk about for sheltering in place, and kind of present this topic before we start getting into removal options. This is probably one of the first few views you guys have had at nerding out in the fire service. I know there's a lot of graphs and whatever. The next slide has a lot of numbers. But there's a lot of cool research that has gone into this stuff. So if you actually look at it and take the time to figure out what it's trying to tell you, it's pretty awesome to look at, or at least I think it is. So let's talk about what's going on in this picture. This was done by the UL. I think we'll have a dedicated class on the UL a little bit later for you guys, but they basically research different fire conditions and what we do within them. This here is a double vented fire. You've got fire coming out of 2 rooms, then you got 5 victims, right? So victim 1 is right in between both fires. Not a super awesome place to be. Victim 2 is in a bedroom, victim 3 is in a bedroom. The difference between them is that victim 2 has the door closed, victim 3 does not. 4 is in the living room and 5 is making dinner in the kitchen. So these 2 graphs on the left, when we look at them, that fractional effective dose is basically measuring when this stuff is going to start going bad for people. So this graph on the left is toxic gas. The FED for toxic gas is 3 on this scale. So 3 would be fatal, 1 is untenable. That graph on the right is for heat flux. 1 here is going to be fatal. So really interesting when we look at this graph on the left, victim 3 is just skyrocketed on there, right? It's interesting when you compare it with victim 2, who is in essentially the same spot in the house, but they have the door closed, right? Their door is even closer to that fire than victim 3 is, but we see a huge difference in survivability because the door is closed. So that's really kind of what the premise for shelter in place is that sometimes we're kind of in a better situation closing ourselves off from the fire than we would be pulling someone out through it. This is the breakdown of all of the experiments that they ran. So if you look at this, it's really interesting to see that only 1 time throughout all of these tests did someone die from total heat flux, and that was victim 1 in that picture that we just saw, which kind of makes sense, right? So toxic gas is going to be the driving factor of death in a fire, right? It's typically not going to be heat. So we have to keep that in mind and make sure we're doing what is actually best for the victim. Chief Bondis and Cap Williams and I and a few others were at a UL class. I think that was probably like a year ago or so, but they talked about a example out of DC fire. Basically what happened was they were doing a search, they found a victim in a bathroom, and they dragged the victim out. Victim was unconscious, but he was dead when they got him out of the structure. When they went back in, they checked out the toilet paper roll and it was completely unburned, totally unharmed in the bathroom. So sheltering in place could have been an option. I'm not trying to say that DC fire messed up. They've been to more fires than I could ever dream of going to in my life, but just kind of something interesting to keep in mind here is that shelter in place is a pretty powerful option. We're going to hit on some really quick removal strategies next, but questions on shelter in place before I move on to that? Cool. All right, let's go through this quick. Again, like I said, I'm not going to hit too much on how to pick people off the floor because it's just going to wash over you. It doesn't really make sense to do that didactically, but we'll hit it ad nauseum once we start doing hands-on. So first floor, right, our plan A is typically going to be out the closest door or window. That might not necessarily be the one you came in on, but figure out where it is, get them out of there. If you don't know where it is, plan B is going to be cut out of your last node way to get out, right? So that's probably the door that you use to come in. Plan C, see it there as shelter in place. There might be conditions that would warrant that to be plan A, right? If you come into a room and suddenly the fire starts to flash on the other side of the doorway in the hallway, maybe it's better to just shut that door and hang out in that room if it's tenable than it would be to try to drag that victim out through the fire. Second floor stuff, plan A, right, down the stairs, out the closest door or window. That's really a kind of, I don't know how to put it, like fantasy world that we could easily drag someone down the stairs and out of a door. It's super hard to get someone down the stairs, and not to mention all the heat, the smoke, bad stuff for them. So plan B would be out the closest window. Caveat to that being, again, it's tough to get ladders up to windows when you need them unless stuff is already set up. Plan C, again, shelter in place. When we're high up, so think about stuff over 3 floors, like Blackhawks casinos, any big building that we're going to, right? Shelter in place is going to be super effective here. So in high-rise fires, we typically tell people to stay in their rooms until we tell them to leave, right? There's a lot going on in high-rise fires. There's firefighters dragging hoses and stairwells. There's people running down stairwells. It's just super cluttered. There's a lot going on. Sheltering in place is typically going to be great if we can do it. Plan B, out the closest window. Again, that's sort of a fantasy world, right? Getting a ladder 5 stories up is not super easy. But if we can do it, awesome. That's a good way to get someone out quickly. Finally, if we can get that person to a safer floor, that might be our best bet. So if they're on the fire floor and there's a lot going on, if we can get them off of the fire floor and onto a different floor that's a little bit more tenable, that's typically going to be a good move for us rather than try to drag them out through the attack line and stuff like that happening in the hallway. Last slide here would be basement. Basement fires really suck and they kind of stretch what we can do. So plan A in a basement fire is up and out the closest door or window, right? So that might be the way that we came down. If there's a window for some reason that's super big in a basement that you came in on, use it. But typically that's not going to happen. So if you can get them up the stairs and out, do it. The caveat to that is that fires in basements provide a nice chimney effect, which I'm sure you guys talked about. It's really hard to be in a stairwell coming out of a basement. So keep that in mind. But if you have something like a walkout, use it. Use your surroundings to your benefit. Plan B would be out a basement window. Again, sort of fantasy world here. Basement windows are tiny. They're really hard to open. They're hard to get people through. They're hard to get firefighters through. We've got our prop that we built out. We can train on some of this stuff, but this is going to be really difficult. So if you've got a big basement window and you got your crew set up for it, rock it. Otherwise, we're kind of starting to think about going up through a floor, trying to bring them up through the staircase. Shelter in place is really kind of a tough tactic in the basement, especially if your fire's down there. It's not super easy to get people out, and fires can typically overtake the basement really quickly. Not to mention the entrapment possibility if that building starts to come down. Sorry, I know I went through that last part kind of quickly, but do we have questions at all on removal methods or anything like that? Anything that anyone wants to add? All right, so I know we'll drill on that kind of ad nauseum once we can get hands on.